Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fantasy Magical Systems panel. I'm Charlie C.W. Lamb. I'll be moderating this session. Jeffrey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey L. Kohanek. I write epic fantasy.
Anthea?
I'm Anthea Sharp, and I write science fantasy, which would now be called Gamelit, where a high-tech game opens a portal to the realm of fairy, and I also write epic and secondary world fantasy.
Troy?
Troy Osgood. I write the series Sky Realms Online, which is a lit RPG using game mechanics within the writing and a bunch of other little stuff here and there.
Awesome. Well, our charter, so to speak, says that we're using magic casting can take all forms in fiction. What makes a good magic system, and what are some of your favorites? Anthea, I actually know you had an opinion on this. Why don't you start?
We had some pre-panel chats a little bit about the various kinds of magic systems, which I think we can definitely touch on, like if you're drawing from elemental magic or the magic of folklore, or Charlie, I think you mentioned like magic using objects as focuses. So I think let's maybe start there with the more traditional magic systems, and then, but I would like to touch on some of the kind of newer, more creative magic systems that I've seen some authors come up with in their books. So.
Awesome. Troy, Jeffrey, you guys?
Oh, that sounds like a good place to start.
Well, I had mentioned when Anthea and I were originally talking about this, and I think, like I said, I sent it out to you guys. I mean, the basics of so much of what I've been playing with are, you have your magical creatures, the elves, the dwarves, the dragons, and all of that type of thing. And then the magic around objects, the bow that shoots a mile, the sword that can slice through stone, attributes and such, which are not necessarily explained magic. They're just inherent and accepted magic. And then there's the magic where you're trying to give your character certain abilities, and you want to try to lend them some credibility as to why they can do these things.
Yeah,
so
I think
within lit RPG, so what is your magical system within Sky Realms, where the game mechanics are, people are leveling up, they're gaining skills. What kind of magical system have you laid out for your characters?
I kept mine pretty simple, and it's one of those ones that's fairly undefined on how why and how they do it. I mean, if you look like, something like World of Warcraft, they just cast spells. You don't know necessarily why or where the energy comes from or how it's based, and keeping it kind of simple. But the thing I like about having to do it in like a lit RPG is you kind of quantify all the values. So if you cast a fireball, keeping it simple, you have to know exactly what that's going to do, what the parameters of it are, how widespread it could be, how the range, the amount of damage it's going to do. And then as the characters get stronger, you actually have numbers associated with all those, where, a lot of systems are just, you cast a fireball and, it does whatever damage you need to do at that time, or what effect you need to do. There's really no set parameters that control what it is.
Do you ever actually literally roll the dice while you're writing to determine your amount of damage? Or?
I don't. No, I cheat, and I know what the result I want is, so I kind of cheat. But I have a nice document of rules that tell me I can only do, and I have it set up by the Dungeons and Dragons dice system, so I know I can only do 2d damage plus a certain amount, and so I kind of say, well, okay, I want him to do this attack, I wanted to do more damage. So I kind of know what my limits are and how much I can do, and then kind of have to carry it through. I'm not as crunchy as other people. Like, I know a good one is Life in Exile by Sean Oswald, and he actually gets down into the actual values for everything. So when his characters cast a spell, you actually see the amount of damage percentage wise and resistance and all that stuff calculated out.
And crunchy for people watching the stream who
Yeah.
aren't familiar with that term. In lit RPG, that means the stats actually being on the page and the game mechanics just really being. Yeah. That's funny that you mentioned, dice and your D2 or your D20 and Dungeons and Dragons. An urban fantasy series that gotten a great deal of popularity a couple of years ago was Annie Billet's 20-Sided Sorceress, which even though it's not lit RPG, her character in coming to terms with her magic is inspired by the types of D&D spells that she knows as a gamer. And so she's not particularly rolling for damage or things, but kind of using the idea of, there's a spell where you can cast a fireball in Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm going to try and channel that with my sorceress power and cast a spell. But that was the sort of the framework outside of a lit RPG setting.
How about you, Jeff?
So going back to what I think makes a strong magic system, whether it's something hard magic and well-defined or mystical, I think it's very important that the author, at least to themselves, know what limitations they're going to set, right? So magic should have limitations and some cost, right? So whether that cost is in, energy or blood or whatever it is, it costs you something. Sometimes you have a magic system where the more you use the magic, the shorter your lifespan becomes or whatever it is. I tend to write hard magic more than anything. And that just means that I actually explain to the reader basically as the reader reads, they understand the magic almost as much as the person casting it. So, whether it's like my first series, you would draw a rune, and a rune is like it has a distinct meaning for physics. So one rune means reduced gravity. You draw that rune on an object and you apply magic to it, and then it floats up or whatever, right? And then you can apply that to people. There's a way to do that as well. So it's just hard magic, I think, is fun because as the reader, you kind of feel like you're experiencing what this wizard or mage or sorcerer or whatever what it is it takes for them to make it work. And then also sometimes it's fun to have mystical magic where it's like, wow, something cool happened. I don't understand it. But again, you got to have some limitations. Otherwise,
And it all has to be logical within the confines of the story.
Absolutely.
And every world can be different. So, one story does magic's one way and the other one's something else. But in each of those stories, they have to be consistent and logical to that story world.
Right.
I kind of cheated on mine. The first couple books of my fantasy series, I was very into what you described, which is the characters, particularly the human or the humanoid characters who were magical. The energy of the magic came from them. And like you said, for them to perform magic, it was a penalty to their own physiology. But then around book 3, I kind of cheated that to go from a mage or an apprentice magic wielder to the true wizard, you had to learn to be able to draw from sources outside of you and channel that energy. And that's in fact how magical creatures lived, like dragons and elves and things. Yeah. Their essence was the ability to absorb that energy, and then to be a wizard you needed to learn how to absorb it and then release it. So I kind of fudged on my own system, but
yeah, I took back in 2016. I wrote my first book I ever published was a fantasy. It was more aligned with D&D and the rules, but I used runes for the magic. But I was trying to do it like a class system in D&D, and I published that. And then the second book just was such a fight to get out, and I realized towards the end of it that it was because I hadn't really adequately, for me, defined the magic system. And I was trying to make it do two different things along two different lines, and it just wasn't working very well. So I ended up taking those down, and eventually I was hoping for this year, but it's probably going to be next year. I'm going to republish that first book and redefine everything based on a more concrete magic system.
Yeah, I hate it when you set rules in the first book that really screw you up.
Yep.
I don't know about you guys. When I start a book, I don't always know how it's going to end. So
No,
if I'm looking at a series 2 or 3 books down the road, that can be really problematic.
Yep.
So Troy, what kind of cost does your magical system have in terms of mana or strength?
Yeah, just Skyrims I just kept fairly simple. So it's just a straight mana or energy, as it's called, drain. The more you use, the more it gets drained. And it's just basically just using the later books. Actually, the one I'm in the process right now kind of defines more where the energy comes from, and just using the basically the ley line idea of strips of energy throughout the world. And in my world, the world's basically fractured islands. The whole planet exploded, and it's magic that's holding everything together through the ley line systems and using branches of, they call it the world tree, to kind of hold everything together.
Uh-huh. And that's kind of a classic, the idea of places of power in the earth, the standing circles or the ley lines or the runes.
There's a question somebody's asking about, have any of you created a magic system that actually ends up having a pseudoscience basis behind it? And I can answer this in part. It was actually kind of, and I'm totally embarrassed, I cannot remember the author who wrote the Recluse series, but the basis, but the basis of his magic was order and chaos. That in a magic wielder was someone who was able to restructure the essence of stone or iron to steel or whatever, and then chaotic wizards were the ones who actually removed order and created disorder in the subjects, and that has a very physics-based concept to it.
And you get into the whole sufficiently advanced technology, indistinguishable from magic kind of a thing. So Jeff, when you were talking about if you know the rune, that then can conjure up the physical principle or effect that you want. So the magic of the language of being able to name something then creates the reality that you're looking for, which I think, I don't know if you've ever read Babel 17, a classic of the science fiction genre, but part of that underlying structure of that very short tale was that there was a advanced civilization that had language down to the point where when you spoke a word, it told you, like, for example, the hero was able to get out of being trapped in a net because the word net also contained all of the places where the structure of a net would be weak, so that then you could just break it apart. And it was this idea of language as magic.
Wasn't Aragon kind of that too? There's a whole spiel in there about knowing the word makes you able to manipulate, but it has to be in the Elven language to make that work.
Right.
Yeah. Name of the Wind, or the Kingkiller Chronicles, is kind of like that too, right? But you have to know the true name of this thing, and that's kind of when I mentioned the runes. That's what these runes are. They're the true representation of these physics or emotions or whatever it is you're trying to charge and manipulate. Yeah.
And I think also with one of the fun things about Lit RPG and Game Lit is that we do get to go to that that virtual space where in technology, we can put on our Oculus or whatever, and you're flying, or you are casting spells, or you are. So I think that's almost like a scientific-based magic in the virtual reality can grant us certain powers that we maybe can't have walking around our real life.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched like with the portal thing where you're physically or you occupy one space, but to be able to transcend to someplace else where you have superpowers that you don't have naturally is part of your storyline.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I have found it very interesting recently, sort of transitioning over into different magical systems. I don't know if any of you read Gideon the Ninth, which it's wonderful. It's a new fantasy series that deals with necromantic magic, and so it's all using the magic of necromancy. But also it's the science fantasy because they're in space and they're on spaceships and they're dealing with the death of the universe, which is fascinating. But what are magic systems you guys have run into that you've thought, oh, that's so cool, I kind of wish I'd come up with that?
It's, for me, being more of an engineering, whatever, it is trying to tie the physical world and the magical abilities into something that are interrelated. And it almost makes sense if you just had the ability to do that with your mind or whatever, the ability to manipulate water, to manipulate, the way air flows or moves or whatever. But in a context of the person that's doing this is literally almost driving it with their thoughts or their mind, but it's a magical connection that makes it work.
Yeah, I've seen one that I liked recently was I liked and I didn't like was the Powder Mage books by Brian McClellan.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea of the powder mages and manipulating gunpowder and using that kind of chemical reaction. But I didn't like the it became with a P, but I can't remember what the main magic uses in that series were. But they had, they wore gloves to restrict and control their power, but they were too powerful in a way. One guy could eliminate armies of thousands instantly, kind of deal. But I liked the idea of being able to use he had another one was the bone mages using bones and that kind of stuff to cast their spells, and then the powder mages. I liked being a different element than you normally see.
Yeah, two that come to mind that are a little bit different. They actually use kind of like there's a familiar or like there's a spirit that's in things. So Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, right? So if you have a familiar that's a storm familiar, you have the power of the storms and that kind of thing. Another one is Codex Alera, which almost is kind of like Pokemon where you capture or something. Well, all these different things like fire, trees, water, whatever, they have, they're elemental familiars. And that can be kind of fun, and that's a different way to play with magic.
I've heard good things about that series. I keep meaning to check it out because I like Dresden Files.
Oh, I actually like Codex Alera better than Dresden.
I've heard a couple of people say that.
Yeah.
We have another question. Do you find that some novels that deal with magic overlook being able to physically protect yourself just because you can use magic?
I think that's where Jeff's comment about the drawbacks or the weaknesses of magic come into play. Because if you have like going back to the Powder Mage, they're the main magic users, which I really wish I could remember what they're called, but they're so powerful that they had to invent a way to weaken them. Otherwise, they could just dominate everything. So you do have that. You can run into that issue where the magic is too strong, and you do need to come up with some weaknesses so that the non-magic users can deal with it. And you're getting okay. Go, honey.
Yeah. So playing off that, so in my Wizardom series, so I have this series called Fate of Wizardoms. Just to explain, a wizardom is a kingdom controlled by a wizard. So in this, wizards are the ruling class. But in order for wizards to channel magic, which comes from like ambient energy, and it goes through them, they have to wear very loose flowing clothing. So you put armor on these guys and they can't do anything, right? So now what do they weak to? They're weak to physical attacks, right? So that's, and honestly, that series, one of my goals of that whole series was use all these epic fantasy tropes and really explain to people why the tropes are what they are. How down to how elves are created and dwarves and what they really are, all that stuff. It's kind of fun to do that and give this, just my take on all this stuff. Yeah.
That's fun because that's like the built-in, like when you're rolling a character with the lower armor classes are more powerful, but they're more vulnerable, right? So you have like in World of Warcraft, you're rolling a mage, but you can only wear cloth armor. So the glass cannon kind of idea, right?
Right. I'm a gamer, so I play all the RPGs. So I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah.
I haven't gamed since D&D. What was that, 20 years ago? So it's been a while. But I kind of dealt with a similar thing with my character where he comes in to this world. It's a portal fantasy thing. Discovering that he can do magic, but not understanding how to do magic and all of that kind of thing. And so because of that, because he actually knows how to fight, but he doesn't know how to use magic, he works in combining the two so that he can rely on what he knows, but take advantage of what he's learning. Troy, you're muted in case you didn't know.
I think you know.
Yeah, I keep getting photobombed by my daughter.
Looks like another question came through.
Go ahead.
Super Soup Guy asks, have you ever written a character based on the age-old question, if you could have one superpower, what would it be? I haven't. Although that's a fun idea. And that a little bit goes to like your character classes or your elemental mages, or I suppose in the magical system where you're trying to harness a creature, if you go after the fire creature because you've always wanted that. But what would your superpower be?
Wow.
The default is, people want to fly, right? I don't know. But I've never written one either. Although my earlier series I've called Runes of Asalia and Wardens of Asalia, they have the ability to temporarily charge, using these runes I discussed earlier, temporarily charge people with an ability. So if you charge them with a power rune, suddenly they're many times stronger than a regular human, and they can like jump over buildings, right? Because they're so strong. They're they leap and they leap 50 feet high instead of 3 feet high. So that's kind of fun to do that kind of stuff. It's an example of some of the things that you can charge people with.
Well, I want to answer this really carefully because I can get into so much trouble. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I will pick a character in my story and I will pick a person that I know in my real life and put that person's attributes on that character more than anything else, because in my mind, it gives that character more depth as I'm writing them. But what I will say is that I have given them magical abilities that relate to their personalities.
That's cool.
That's an interesting question because it actually brings up that maybe superhero powers tend to not be the kind of generally fantasy powers that you see so much, like flying. I'm like, why aren't there more? Okay, witches can jump on their brooms maybe, but you don't generally have the mages like flying all around everywhere. You generally don't have the laser vision or the X-ray eyes or Mr. Elastic or.
I do know one. I had in my recent series, there was an enchanted object called the Band of Amalgamation, and once you put it on, it permanently changes your body to like metal, so like Colossus from the X-Men. And that was kind of fun. So that was kind of like me taking something from a comic, because I actually love the X-Men, and putting it into my stories.
So
that was fun.
A couple questions here real quick. We've tried to keep these up, and I can answer yes to this one. Were any of you influenced by Christopher Stasheff?
I was not. I'm familiar with his work, though. The Wizard in Spite of Himself was a good classic.
Yeah, no, I read all of his stuff. I love his stuff.
Yeah. I haven't read those for 30 years.
That's actually something I've never heard of. I have to check that stuff out.
So yeah, no, it's good stuff, very entertaining. And then you have touched a little bit on refilling magical reserves, but what about the speed of the refill? And I think you kind of just about touched that there, Jeff. I have used how fast can you recoup from using magic to make magic users more squishy? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that goes back into the whole weakness thing. Is they can't just then they and in game terms you have the mana that you refill through potions or just naturally over time, but there is a limit to how much you can do. So you can only shoot so many spells before you don't have any more energy. And it goes back to the system. If you're doing a system that's out, manipulating outside objects is and not coming from within, there's almost an unlimited amount of time that you can and the stuff that you can do. But if it comes from within, the body can only do so much. No matter how fit you are, or some people can win, the Boston Marathon, others can't. But even the people that won the Boston Marathon, they can only do so much. They can only go beyond that point so much before they run out.
You can't do it 3 days in a row. Yeah.
Right. There's an exhaustion factor. Wait, and sometimes I break that, but I'll do something like there's a stamina spell, but the stamina spell comes with a cost. Like you hit the end of that, you are unconscious for like 3 days.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's always nice when you see the stories where they push themselves to the limits, and then something like that happens. Yeah, they're out for a week, or next thing you know, they wake up and it's been 3 or 4 days, and they're like, "What happened?"
Yeah, right. And that's like I was saying before about creating the physical relationship between using your own energies to make magic or to perform magic. I've always tried to associate it with, like you say, running the marathon. If I'm going to run the marathon, I'm certainly not going to be doing anything strenuous the next day. As part of the character life, I've had mine go, face down and blackout on more than one occasion because they, over exerted themselves in such a short period of time. The body couldn't manage it. We all know passing out is a defense mechanism. So
right. There has to be some cost because otherwise they just go forever.
Well, or like Troy was saying, the privileged in the.
That's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
It was they're too powerful, and that's actually frustrating for a reader, and also very frustrating for an author, obviously, because you have to have those limitations. Christina, I do the same thing. I have a series called the Darkwood Chronicles that have dark elves that are magic users, and they use spoken runes where they are using the elder language kind of a thing. They also have a wellspring within them that once they've used it up, it has to regenerate. And the more powerful the elf mage, the larger their wellspring, and it's kind of like a talent thing, like Troy. Like some people can run the marathon, some people can't, But and in Gideon the Ninth, in that necromantic magic, you had to have certain elements present to be able to cast spells, and then you were also using up those elements, like pieces of bone from corpses, or corpse dust, and then once you've used up your reagent, you can't cast anymore.
Right. Interesting. I'm going to bring up one other one. So in my Wizardom's books, there are each Wizardom has a wizard lord. So somebody's been gifted extra abilities by a god. But the trick is they can't really leave their city because on a daily basis they need to sit in a special throne and take all the prayers from across the city in the Wizardom, and it recharges this mad, it's almost endless pile of magic, but it's so addicting that they don't want to go a day without doing it. So what's their limitation? Their limitation is they're stuck in the city, but otherwise they can instantly heal themselves. They're far more powerful than everybody else. I mean, the key is you have to figure out, how do I define these limitations, right? Mm-hmm. And then when the limitations break, like they figure out as the series goes on, they figure out how to break this limitation. Oh, that's when all hell breaks loose. Yeah.
We have a question. Actually, it's kind of an interesting observation. Says, my fantasy magic reading is quite dated, i.e. classic. It sounds like most of you are almost totally using D&D lit RPG paradigms rather than ancient systems of similarity. Map is the thing, etc. As fantasy as a genre essentially moved past these classics. I would.
It has. No.
No. I mean,
I think it's broadened.
It's probably
Yeah.
I think everybody kind of goes and uses the classics to kind of come up with new ways, because we've all read the classics and we kind of want to come up with our own twists on it. So we're getting to the point where all the new authors have read all that stuff. So we don't want to necessarily duplicate it. We want to take our own spin on it. So I think that's where all the changes are coming in place. It's all based on the classics. It's just new variations.
right.
yeah, and what I was kind of thinking is that I think more than anything else, my recollection of a lot of the classics, I don't remember so many of the classical stories making the main characters pay the penalty. I think there was a lot of, while they weren't super powerful, I don't recall a lot of them really getting penalized for the use of magic. It was more of a learning curve than it was an exercise in control. And maybe I'm just trying to think of the stuff that I've read, the Terry Brooks, the Shannara stuff. The Shannara is probably the closest one where there was a penalty in the use of the magic, but not necessarily in the same context.
One of my favorite classics is Lyndon Hardy's Master of the Five Magics, and then Secret of the Sixth, and Riddle of the Seventh, or whatever it is. What I liked about that is you have this world where you have a bunch of different magic systems, and he was one of the first. This is a long time ago. I think it's the 70s, where it was hard magic. You understood how all this magic worked, and he worked out every system. So I think that these types of things are an influence, as well as the stuff that's more mystical and whatever. But I also think it's fun to have people, the characters in the story, they have to study this magic. They have to learn this magic, if they're a wizard, right? So different classes have different ways that they acquire their abilities. And
I think that I'm thinking back to some classical, Patricia McKillop, particularly. There was Bardic magic in the Riddle Master of Head trilogy, or the Forgotten Beasts of Eld, which is a classic of fantasy, which goes back to that language and the naming and beasts that are magical, And so I think all of this has come through. It's a through line. I don't think we've abandoned those, but I think we just, added with, the huge popularity of, Dungeons and Dragons, and then moving on to like more online MMOs and lit RPG. I think it's sort of, I don't think we've abandoned anything. I think we've just built further on it. And for me personally, I depend a lot on British Isles fairy lore. I use a lot of fairy magic in my books, and the kind of the classic things, and there's a lot of wonderful fairy urban fantasy, Iron Druid, Sean M. McGuire's October Days series, which Charles DeLint, earlier, a great fantasy writer from Canada, who are bringing in all the fairy lore, the things with iron and the things with salt and the things with, various herbs to protect yourselves against the fairies and turn your clothes inside out. And so I think that's...
Yeah.
Well, the fairy lore, to your point, though, that's some of, at least in my experience, you just accept the fact that these creatures are magical. I don't really remember, at least, a lot of explanation about why they're magical or where they get their magic from. They are just magical, and we all accept that. I think with part of this piece, what makes it interesting is I think the readers are a little more sophisticated and want a little bit better or a little deeper experience with the magical world, where it comes from, how it came to be. I mean, like one of the things I kind of did with this most recent book in my series, I have the basis of the book is that the elves are competing in multiple realms. Our world is one of those realms, but in our world, everything's spun out of control. I mean, magic is gone. Nobody uses magic anymore. Well, we find out that what happened is one of the groups of elves captured a dragon who absorbs magic and imprisoned the dragon over the wellspring of magic for our realm, thus blocking the ability to have magic in our realm. So, you know, it kind of, I tried to put together some kind of an explanation of where it came from, what it does, and why we don't have it anymore.
I'm wondering, Jim, who asked the question about a map is the thing. I'm wondering, Jim, if you could expand on your thinking there in terms of like what you mean by a map. I'm thinking of the Marauders map in Harry Potter as a magical map. But, like, so I'm gonna look over the comments and see what Jim has to say there.
So he comes back. Either that or he wandered off to get a drink.
Yeah, I think he's still there.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so Jim is saying the really old Celtic, Druidic, Native American, yeah. So I don't know if you have read Juliette Merlier, but she really pulls in the Druid magic in her fantasy, and the Celtic magic, and it's historical set as well. It's like ancient Celtic fantasy, just really drawing on those Druidic principles.
Right.
Well, I think you and I talked earlier when we were like looking at Outlander and the quasi-Celtic nature of the stones and moving through time and things where they don't really ever bother to explain the magic of the experience. It's just the magic is there, and if you do the right things, you take advantage of the portal.
Mm-hmm. Jim says, can't recall original source. Manipulate the map / drawing means the real thing changes. Yeah, so that idea of resonances, if you, or like a voodoo doll, right? So you change something in some representation, and then it changes in the real world. Which, I mean, that's a cool system too.
Yeah, there was a show I used to watch a long time ago on Sci-Fi. It was called Lost Girl, and it dealt with all the kind of fey creatures living in the real world. And one of the characters was the Blood King, and the thing was anything he wrote in a book became real and became true. So it's kind of along the same lines like Jim's talking about manipulating the map and using the power of the words and your written words and written objects to define and create the magic that makes it real.
Mm-hmm. That's another one of those mystical things, so it doesn't explain why. You just accept that it does.
Yeah, which is fine. That kind of stuff is great as well. You don't necessarily need to define why it happened. It still needs to follow rules within that universe. It just happens. It just has to follow its own rules and its own logic system. But we don't have to understand why it happens that way. Just as long as in the story you know why it happens, so can define why it happens that way.
The author should kind of understand it, so they don't, they don't, break their own limitations.
I did a little bit of a hand-waving exercise, but in my case, like I was saying about the multiple realms, what I did was try to compare our world of technology and an alternate realm of magic. And if you're strong in technology in this realm and you move to the other realm, you'll have these magical abilities. So it's somewhat the nature of the environment that takes your skills and manifests them in the realm that you belong to. So, I mean, like in my story, I have elves who are hackers because their strong magical skills in their realm actually translates to extremely strong technology capabilities in the technology world.
It's interesting.
Jim comments, that he reads hard science fiction for rules and science and fantasy for fun and wonder, which I think is totally true. But like we've been saying here, touching on a lot, there still needs to be that underlying, some kind of underlying consistent rules, even if only the author knows what that is of what makes magic work. I think we've all read, again, the Powder Mage. We've all read series where it's like, yeah, this didn't quite seem totally hammered down, right?
Yeah. I think it's also fun to kind of mix it. So, like I write a series where there's 5 different types of magic, basically. And some are more, you understand better than others, right? So, a wizard, they use constructs and certain patterns. They have to study them and memorize them. And right. So that's pretty hard. But the sorcerers, they use blood magic. And other than the fact that they use some symbols and blood and they mumble some words, you don't really understand how it works. And then, elves, they're nature magic, and dwarves, they've got rock magic. And right, some of them are intrinsic, some of them they train, and then, the reader's knowledge level of these things varies. So you can have wonder and hard magic at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, go ahead.
I'm riffing off what Elizabeth's comment is that we don't understand why transporters work on Star Trek, but accept them. They're magic.
Yeah, well, I actually kind of, I don't know if you want to call it industrialized or commercialized, but I layered mine where mages are magic users of industry. You have a mage who, maybe a sword maker or whatever, because they can generate magical heat that is going to be greater, hotter than any furnace, whereas wizards are the scientists of the magical world. They're the ones that are, exploring the boundaries and trying to unfurl why certain magic does certain things so that they can push it in other directions.
I'm kind of thinking about what Jim said about D&D type progression systems, and thinking about some of the sort of early epic fantasy. I think there's more fantasy now where the protagonist is coming to grips with their own magical power. I mean, Shannara maybe a little bit, and the wizard in spite of himself, but more and more as people, I think, through gaming have been able to put themselves in the shoes of, I am the person who is learning and who is leveling up my magic, or Harry Potter, this idea of the central character is learning their magic instead of the central character lives in a world where there's elves and dragons and magic.
Well, the D&D thing where, you're actually role-playing the wizard and you have a certain set of spells, and then you're dropped into a situation and it's up to you to pick which spell you're going to use and why, versus having somebody tell you that.
Right. I totally agree with what Anthea said, that your point of view, if the point of view character is a magic user, you're going to have the reader understand it more than if it's not, if that person never has a POV. It's totally different. Yeah.
And put them inside their head too, so that you can really kind of deal with the trials and tribulations, not just make them mystical from the outside.
There's a comment about the midi-chloridian. So because the Force is a magical element, basically, and actually it did work better, I think, when it wasn't trying to be scientifically explained. The Force is just, it binds us all together and we can tap into it. That mystical magic kind of idea that we've touched on a little bit.
Yeah, we actually have had quite a few conversations where we bridge that Star Wars fantasy sci-fi piece, with the animals, with the Force. I mean, the Force is very magical. The whole Jedi thing is very wizardry. In a sci-fi.
Obi-Wan is a mage, he's a Gandalf. And yeah, how did Gandalf do his thing? Magic.
Yeah. Well, he had a lot of rules, as I recall, too. So.
That is a great example of the system where there is no definition. It just happens and you accept what it is.
Right.
And Gandalf's another interesting one because in a lot of ways he's not we think of Gandalf as a typical wizard, but he's not really. He's not as much of a pure spellcaster as you think of a wizard.
Right.
He's just kind of more of, I don't know a good way to describe him, but we picture Gandalf as a typical wizard, but when we really look at it, he's really not.
Magical ranger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a flashpoint though. He's a fate focus character, right? Where he is either by intent and design or by chance or fate, he is in a position to help completely reshape the world by just moving, by being that little lever, right? That just moves things.
And he always knows more than everybody, but doesn't really explain it.
Yeah.
So we got a 5-minute warning. I don't know if that includes the ability for everybody to say goodbye or not. So I want to make sure everybody has a time to put their little spiel in. Troy, you want to go first?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on here. It's been lots of fun and interesting. It's always interesting to get into one of these things and get different viewpoints on the stuff you look at. We kind of work almost in an echo chamber sometimes, so it's nice to get out and talk about it with other people.
Where can people find your stuff?
You can find me on Amazon. I'm online a lot on Facebook. You can join me on Ozzy's World on Facebook, which is my Facebook group, OSSY+VS. And I'm on Facebook way too much. So you can always find me there.
Anthea.
So you can find me at antheasharp.com, and my books are mostly available wide. My Feyland Gamelight series is right now on Kindle Unlimited. Actually, my Dark Elves are also on Kindle Unlimited right now. But just the web, Anthea Sharp on Facebook would be a great way to connect with me too. Like you, Troy, I maybe am on Facebook a little too much.
Jeffrey?
Yeah. So jeffreylkohanek.com. So I have my website. We all have a website. If you go there, you can even get some free books by signing up for my newsletter. All my books right now are on Amazon and Audible only because I've been in Kindle Unlimited. But next year I'm going to start taking some of them to other stores. Why? At least ebooks are there. Print books you can get anywhere. Yeah.
And audio too.
Yes, I'm on Facebook. Too much. Anybody sends me anything, I always respond. I love talking to readers. It's my favorite. Yeah.
If you try to go to Charles Lamb on the internet, you're going to get a 18th century English literary guy. So cw-lamb.com is where my website is. I'm mostly, as everybody says, on Amazon. I'm actually the Ranger series. I always get this backwards. My Ranger series is I'm taking it out of KU. Taking it out of KU so I can take it wide as for an experiment. I've been on Amazon for several years now, and I've kind of hit that point where, I think we've all seen it. Until you release a new book, everything kind of just goes steady, but we'll see what I can do in the wide world. If not, then it always can all go back to KU. But yeah, anyway, cw-lamb.com. You can get on my email list there. I am on Facebook as well. With the elections over, hopefully I can be on Facebook more and not have to worry about offending the political. I actually have people from both sides who buy my book, which means I don't want to offend anybody.
I also wanted to mention, you can find both me and Jeffrey as part of Portal to Fantasy. And if you go to portaltofantasy.com, you'll have an opportunity to snag a whole bunch of great fantasy and epic fantasy books. So
awesome. Great.
Cool. Well, thank you, Charlie and Jeffrey. And I think Troy has had some family obligations.
Yeah, it's actually been really interesting. For the most part, this has gone really well. We've had very few of those, and at work, we've had a lot of those incidents, and we've pretty much told everybody you need to accept that as part of life these days.
Yeah.
All right, Nick.